Well, I hope everyone's having a pleasant Memorial Day weekend. Um, Presently, I'm recording this. It's Sunday morning, almost noon, actually. Um, so, getting ready. We've been already busy today, my wife and I. So this is the recording on um, the Puritan understanding of technological origins. So we're presenting some ideas about technology. And we're going back 400 to 500 years to talk about where or to talk about, I'd rather not, I generally don't think of it in this way, but really it's a theory of technology. I don't think we ever use that term in the paper. But I think it provides you with some surprises. Okay, particularly for those of you who are technology leadership folks. But I think all of us as teachers, we now live in a world where advances, quote unquote advances, changes in our technologies are rapid and constant. It's almost a hyperactivity, in part, large part, because with each change in technology, in each app that's developed, and money can be made. So nothing is left to really mature. The things, I guess, in a sense, the laptop is basically a mature technology now. The desktop is a mature technology now. The applications are constantly evolving. Memory, we can get more. We're probably at some of the limits of memory in the standard way. So the way a computer works as a machine is pretty well established. I don't know. The changes are in artificial. There are changes in artificial intelligence, and that then, the question is that the question I always have, I guess because I'm older, is and have really, in my adult life, have really watched the evolution of computers and with much amazement. So anyway, so this is kind of where we're beginning. I'm going to share the screen, two different things on the screen eventually. These are my notes. Hopefully I will, I think I wanted to put something down. I probably will add something as I'm talking. So, so I open with the question, what is technology? And My guess is most of you, when you see a question like that, you think of a device. Okay. And if we understand a device as a tool, then yeah. Okay. But tools have not always been called technologies, I think. Although we understand that from the Greeks, right, that the use of a tool, the Greeks attributed to that their concept of techne, which is where we get technology from. Okay. Um, and so, but I want to go a little further than just the idea of a tool or device, because an app is a tool. It's not a device, but it's a tool. Okay. Um, so I would suggest a different way of thinking about technology. And I would suggest that technology is a way of thinking that is born out of a technique. Now you go, oh, okay. Is that a little redundant, a little circular? Well, depends on what you understand a technique to be. You notice here I have the term form of life. Now um, I draw upon Wittgenstein. Ludwig Wittgenstein basically argues that there's a way, the technology denotes a way of thinking. And so, does the technology cause us to think about the world differently? And I would say yes. It may not necessarily be all of a sudden, but as we use the technology, it changes the way we think about the world. Okay. So it's a way of thinking tied to a form of life that uses a device in some way, a technique. Think of the smartphone and how that has changed our lives. Okay. I think somebody came out with a book called The Flat Earth Theory. Okay. And basically, he's arguing that technologies flatten the earth for us. Makes, and what he means by flat here is it puts everyone in a more equal footing. Okay. It's interesting how and that was at the beginning of this century. Okay. It's funny how woke culture seems to have forgotten about that. That's as far as I'll go with that. It's a form of technology is a form of life tied to a technique. We certainly understand this in teaching because to some degree, how we teach changes with the technologies. There's certain things about teaching that don't change necessarily. And one of those ways is that teaching is about how we use language, okay, both written and oral. And certainly while this course, as an asynchronous online course, what we lose is the immediacy of that face-to-face classroom. This is not something that Ames would ever have thought possible. Okay. So who is Ames? Real quick. So Ames is a Puritan theologian. He is what is called a separatist Puritan, meaning he believed that the Puritans needed to break away from the Anglican Church. They saw the Anglican Church as being, which is the official Church of England, right, as being too papist, being too closely aligned to the religious ways of the Catholic Church. Okay. And so they wanted to break away, and they realized that to break away meant that they would have to leave England or revolt. Well, eventually, Ames is not part of the Puritan Revolution started by Oliver Cromwell. I don't remember the years. I want to say 1640s and 50s. Somebody can fact check me on that one. Maybe into the 1560s, and which began with the beheading of King Charles II. But prior to that moment, okay, separatist Puritans left England. The most famous of these for America, for the United States, are the people we call the Pilgrims. Okay, and in fact, Ames was a chaplain for the group of pilgrims, some of whom got together, chartered the Mayflower and came to the New World and founded Plymouth Colony. I'm not going to say New England at this point because it didn't exist. Okay. What's probably more important to us is that Ames's writings, both his theologies, but also his educational writings, which technometry, which is what this article is based upon largely, is the most famous and becomes the foundation of Harvard College. It is the educational practice, if you will, of Harvard from its founding into the 18th century, and it doesn't really become changed until the work of Jonathan Edwards, who was a Yale grad, think of Yale as an extension of Harvard early on, who begins to change the logic from the Ramus logic used by Ames to the logics of John Locke. And Edwards is the founder of the revival movement in American religion, part of the First Great Awakening. And you think of the tent revival, right? But up to that point, Ramus continues to be the operative secular scholar. The technometry is an adaptation of Ramus's work. As I said, it forms the basis. All of the Harvard theses that were completed for for graduation all had the term technometry in them, up until some point in the 18th century. Okay, and I'm pretty sure I know we talk about that. So technologia, where's that word come from? Well, it's a Latin term, and what it really means is systematic study, okay, which is fairly different from how we talk about technology, okay? So technology, which really comes from the Latin, means systematic study. So think of Ramus's method in his systematizing for efficiency purposes of the liberal arts as a technologia. So curriculum is born out of this concept. What the Puritans do is they make technology, what Ames does, but I think Puritans largely, they make technology a moral imperative, right? Make technology a moral imperative. And I would suggest that thread of understanding of technology as a moral imperative continues as we strive to both make money, okay? There are those who argue that the more money you make, the more God's blessing you and the more moral a person you are. It's not a very Catholic way of thinking, but it is a way of thinking tied to some religious ideas. But to the point that technology does good in society, that's a moral imperative. Does it? I'm back to Whitehead. Does the technology improve a person's life? Okay. Does the technology improve a person's life? Does education, does schooling improve a person's life? Okay. And in a way, it's tied to this idea of one best method, of a kind of orthopractice, okay, of doing something. Now, in an age, let's say from the mid 19th century to the mid 20th, where technologies were allowed to mature, maybe a little bit later than that, were allowed to mature, okay, then we can understand this better in terms of the one best method of doing something, okay? You know, let's some of you probably don't remember the you know, how we got the VHS tape deck, okay? Because there was also a beta tape deck, two different ways of recording things on tape, okay, magnetic tape. The best method, meaning the most efficient method, was VHS, although the quality wasn't quite as good as beta. VHS won, and that became the standard until the CD, DVD, okay? And we see with that, the kind of evolution became much quicker through that in Blu-ray and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What technometry does as well, what Ames's technometry does as well, is it latches on to this idea of reforming the threefold tool of education, right? Nature, art, and exercise or practice. Remember that nature is not seen as sufficient. It's not useful enough. Art is required to enhance and improve nature, to make our lives better, right? Rather than hunting and gathering in the wilderness. Think of the first time someone used a stick to plant grain. That's a piece of technology. The first time Homo erectus, we'll go back that far, picked up one rock and struck it on a piece of flint and created a better tool, okay? A better arrowhead, a better chopping tool. Okay? So to be human is to be technological. part of and we also know, by the way, that Homo erectus, at least the people that made flint tools, were right-handed. Okay, because we know that the left side of the brain was more developed. I don't remember the relationship, but that's how we know. Okay. In the generation just prior to Ames, you had Francis Bacon writing about what he called the new learning, which is the learning by experimentation, by empirical data, okay, by induction, if you will. And I suggest that this is at a point where our ideas of education began to privilege art over nature more than it had been, where we decide the use that nature is not cannot be useful enough. Cannot be used. What's interesting for Bacon, nature in itself cannot show us enough about science and what we understand to be the physical, biological world. Then we have to do experimentation. We have to begin to demonstrate as absolutely as possible the truths of nature. Okay. But it's also in terms of reason, okay, of whether it's law or history, government. This was Bacon's effort following or preceding, because I guess he influences Descartes in reasoning, where we go beyond emotion, okay, nature again. So Ames's art, again, remember we're talking about instruction when we talk about art here in the threefold tool. So Ames's art, but it's also art is short for artificial. Okay, so we have we have something called natural logic, natural dialectic. But natural dialectic, in order to teach it, right, we have to improve upon it in order to demonstrate how logic works. So I can't just run through it willy-nilly. I have to systematize it. Back to Technologia, right? I have to systematically establish rules for and methodize natural dialectic in order to teach it. But Ames says art is the idea of eupraxia, or good action. So now we're getting into a bit of the theological, okay? But he talks about this in terms of the technometry that is methodically delineated by universal rules. So think of setting up rules of procedure as a technology. Think about the rules of procedure in your own classroom, for your own business, for your own office, okay? For how to coach, okay? You just don't coach by giving players a ball and telling them to go run around, Actually, I actually did some of that, but there's a reason for it when I coach rugby. But anyway, so the idea, art is the idea of eupraxia or good action. That's eupraxia means good action, it's Greek, methodically generated by universal rules. So the art here is by developing rules, systematizing our understanding of that, the concept of whatever that art is. Okay, I just use the example of logic or dialect. So what Ames's technometry is a systematic understanding or a systematic study of the 7 liberal arts. And they've changed a little bit, okay, of the liberal arts, of the things you learned in school. We're still dealing in the liberal arts. We haven't moved to humanities quite yet. We will, in another generation, begin to see more modern subjects. But Ames is his mature writings is in the early part of the 17th century. I want to say, I think I have it in there. He dies from a cold, basically. He went to help a friend in Rotterdam. He's been living and teaching in Holland, and catches Rotterdam flooded a lot in those days. Holland being below sea level, a lot like New Orleans, a lot like Louisiana. And he was really on his way to New England to take control of Harvard College. So we're talking about the late 1630s. All right, so he doesn't live long enough to see that transition, okay, into the humanities at the university. Sorry. I was trying to do it. Okay. So that's one aspect. The second is we get a bit more religious here. So this notion of calling, this is something I talk about with my undergrads when I teach 250 a lot. There's a piece by a scholar named Dwayne Huebner. This was a regular semester, you would have read something else by Huebner. It was called Teaching as Vocation. So calling is your vocation, what you're being called to do in the world, called ostensibly by God, okay? Because for Ames, the technometry and all secular learning is a tool that helps you find your calling, your place in the world, to live a godly life. Okay? And he has something called a circle of knowledge or encyclopedia, which we can understand as a literal curriculum or circular racetrack. Okay? And I am going to stop sharing this. And I'm going to share an image. I thought it was part of the article, but I guess not. We meant it to be. So here's Ames's circle of knowledge or encyclopedia. So really, people don't realize that what encyclopedia originally refers to is a circle. And you can only think of education as a circle after curriculum is part of the lexicon, of the way we describe curriculum. Now realize, as Puritans, they're Calvinist. Calvin is probably the person that really introduces the idea of a curriculum vitae. So the circle of life, that's curriculum vitae, okay? So this is simplified. If think of Ramus's map of Cicero's life. It's a specific example. Here we have a map of one's life, but it's different. Whereas Cicero's was highly secular. This one, we can see that God plays a role, okay, a key role. So it's also understood as a circle of life. So, and you see how the circle moves from God to things to man to art. There is, if there's nature, it's things. Okay? But we have, what's interesting is what we have inside. Okay? Creation, discovery, imitation, glory. Okay? And all this is tied to the technometry, as well as the calling to live a life. Okay? Notice how the circle is left open at things, at creation, and how discovery is also, the gap is bracketed by creation and discovery. So Puritans, as millennialists, right, they were expecting the final days, even within their lifetime, if you will. They were expecting revelations to be fulfilled, even in their lifetime. But they believe that to do that, for that to happen, we have to discover all knowledge that is possible. Well, of course, we're still discovering new things. Okay. So part of our inquisitiveness as a society to discover, right, our science, if you will, but also our inquisitiveness in history, let's say, in literature, to find new things. All this is part of the same impulse. It's very Puritan. Okay. So it's open-ended at things, because I think it also recognizes that things may change. New things beget newer things. Okay, so at least they had that understanding. They thought there was a limit. Puritans did. Be interesting because I've not seen anything in Ames's writings, although I haven't looked at them in a bit. So, an imitation clearly is to imitate the life, is to use the secular world to help you imitate the life of Christ, to do good works, which is an interesting eupratema, right? You practice and you, so art leads to you practice or good action, which leads to good works. So good works is how you demonstrate your godliness. Okay, it's not a Pelagianism or a heresy, or saying that I earn my salvation, but it demonstrates my godliness, that I'm on my way, that I am saved. Okay. And the glory, of course, is the glory to God. Okay. What's missing from the threefold tool, of course, is exercise, but it's there, it's implied. Okay, it's applied in discovery, because discovery, I may learn how to discover in school, but discovery is something I do through my lifetime. And I think we talk about a English Puritan lather in this article. Lather being somebody who works wood with a lathe, and how he's an observer of his community, and how that sort of epitomizes the Puritan notion of being educated, because he's discovering things about his neighbors so that he can caution them if they're not leading a godly life. That's his practice or exercise of art, of schooling, of instruction. Okay. All right. I'll stop sharing this. I'll return to my notes and finish up. The need for labor to methodize your knowledge of both the external and internal world. So methodize your knowledge of the things outside and the things in your mind, your internal world. What we see in our use, in the way we think about technology, and I would suggest this is as we move into the 19th century, the 18th, 19th century, life seems to be getting better. We begin to, and also our westward expansion is understood through this as well. Because it's quickly realized that the way to make money, the way to develop the economy is through the exploitation of natural resources. And this is the primary way that all peoples have developed their economies. Okay, don't have time to get into that. But there's a loss of the moral imperative. We don't think we're acting in a moral way, and so the question, we never ask the question, well, we got a new technology, should we use it? We just do. There's some article about some attempts to do human animal hybrid cloning. To me, that goes against my moral sensibilities, that idea, for instance. But people are going to go out there because they think they can make money at it. Will it help us? I don't see how, not in any good way. Okay, and finally, secular logic. If it can be used, it should be used. Okay, usefulness overrides the moral and ethical. Well, there's a moral aspect to usefulness, but it becomes secondary. We don't ask the moral and ethical questions enough. We don't ask those questions enough. Okay, so that's the end of the video. If I've raised questions, email me. If there are other things you want to talk about concerning this, obviously email me. All right. Take care.